looking forward to this conversation. Let's begin with your thoughts on translation as both practice and a way of being. You describe translation as both a way to avoid writing and a space where you feel free. What does translation mean to you, not just as a practice, but as a way of being?
Well, thanks. First of all, thanks so much for having me. I'm quite honored. I think this is the first podcast I do where I'm like participate. I'm the only exclusively participating, so I'm flattered.
Yeah.
Um, I have a bad habit of like the things that I write. I often just tend to forget completely what I wrote the moment it's published. But
Yeah.
I would say that for me, translation is, I think it's how we exist all the time. I mean, whenever we speak, whenever we act, we are translating our impulses, and we're not just translating, we're interpreting, we're filtering um, in real time. I mean, all language, in a way, is translation of your brain waves, of your emotions, of your body chemistry, of so many things. So for me, like to work between different languages is, I think, is an extension of that. I don't know if that sounds a bit like airy fairy or what, but it's that's thinking about it. That's how I feel. It's just that the having I maybe wouldn't have realized it had I not ended up becoming a translator. But having become a translator, it's just, I feel like I realized like how much we are all like translating for ourselves and for others all the time. I don't know, I can't speak for people who live, who spend like long periods in solitude, what it's like for them. But, in this sort of electronic virtual age, even a lot of those people have to interact in some way or the other with others. So I think that human interaction is all human interaction in some way or the other involves translation.
So, so I want to build on that. Walter Benjamin describes translation as a mode of existence. You describe it as a maqam, a disposition or a state of being. There's an ontological component to that. How do you personally experience translation as a way of navigating the world?
Um, well, I liked what Walter Benjamin said in terms of the maqam. It's so in Arabic music, music theory, the maqam is kind of similar to the rag in South Asian music, where it's kind of a loose template of melody or notation within which you have a lot of freedom and a lot of challenge to work. And so I think that's how, for me, that's how I experience translation. And it also depends in which, whether I'm doing it into English or out of English. Um, and sorry, what was the end part of your question? I was just riffing on kind of what being translation as maqam means.
How do you personally experience translation as a way of navigating the world?
Um, well, it is the main way at the moment that I make a living. But I also very much enjoy translation. Sometimes it feels like very mundane kind of work, almost like, putting bricks together. And it's not so much this kind of artistic, creative impulse, but then maybe a lot of, what is artistic, creative work is like that also. That only 5% of it are those like flashes or whatever that you have where you feel like you're in some other kind of modus or state of mind. But as someone who uses more than one language daily, I'm not talking just about my translation work. That too is a kind of existence of translation for me.
You've written that being non-binary and mixed race makes you a more sensitive translator because you exist between different identities. How do queerness and translation overlap for you?
Well, I would say definitely transness and translation overlap for me, and it's not just to make like a kind of dad joke pun, but I do think that, and this is not there's many amazing, all the amazing translators are, so many are, it's not about that if you are non-binary or trans you will be necessarily a good translator, but I do think in my experience that that part of my personal experience or development is not, it's not a coincidence perhaps that that translation is what I ended up going into. I do think in my, for me there is a connection, and I think especially as someone who's kind of non-binary and who's not kind of a, I would say just a sort of a like male to female transsexual. um I've always had this sort of indecision and ambivalence about my identity, but I also think that it has kind of made me, it has made me more receptive and sensitive to the logics of the other languages that I have managed to acquire, where I I feel more easily at ease or at home, and it is not, uh, they do not feel as foreign to me as maybe they would to others. I don't want to speak for others, of course, but I do think that my sort of being in a sort of liminal zone in terms of my own identity. I mean, this is of course other than just being a mixed race kid, being growing up bilingual to some extent, but I do think that in my case it has kind of made opened me up and a kind of made me like very, very easy for me to absorb uh, other languages, let's say.
Unlike English, Arabic has grammatical gender in all verbs, nouns, and adjectives. And Arabic is a deeply gendered language, even in its verbs. How do you navigate gender when translating? Do you see translation as a way of queering language?
For sure. The people, I got asked this question in the past also, where someone was like, this is such a intensely gendered sort of binary language, but at the same time I do think that the intricacy has kind of opens up for a lot of play with these rules, and there's also some like interesting kind of variations or exceptions to the rule that, for example, in Arabic, a non-human plural is treated as a grammatically as a female, as the female singular. I find that quite interesting, and it's a conventional thing, and sometimes it, especially in speech, people break it or they mess with it. So I think it's just in general like there's a sort of opportunity for play, one could say.
Excellent. Queer and diasporic communities often develop coded language to express identity and desire? Have you noticed any kind of linguistic subversion in Arabic literary traditions?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the portrayal of queer desire or queer, identity, and we don't want to be anachronistic and impose labels onto completely different contexts and
Mm-hmm.
time periods, but certainly one could say non-heterosexual practice or desire is present in the Arabic literary heritage from a long, long time ago. Um, but so sorry, what was the rest of what was you were asking?
Uh, I was asking whether queer and diasporic communities often develop coded
Yes,
languages.
yes, yes. So I did recently work. Took I recently took part in this publication called the Queer Arab Glossary, which is the project is the brainchild of Marwan Kabour, who's a Lebanese graphic artist based in London.
Mm-hmm.
And he has a page on Instagram called Takwir, which is like the verb form of queering. It's kind of made up, but it also in classical Arabic it means to like curve something and make it like into a ball. And it's also the
Mm-hmm.
name of one of the surahs in the Quran. One of the short ones at the end, that the ones that describe in detail what, like, the day of reckoning will be like, and so on. But anyway, he on this page, he at some point he started asking people to send any slang that they use in Arabic from whatever region in their daily life when it's in relation to queerness, and managed to get over like 350 terms. And I worked with him in sort of making these terms in both Arabic and English, into making these terms kind of like dictionary entries. Um, and the book just came out a few months ago. You guys can find it. It's published by Saki Books, which is a bilingual Arabic English publisher in London. That has published a lot of feminist and erotic and queer books in both languages. So, to some extent, that would answer your question a little bit, where it doesn't claim to be complete in any sense, to any extent, but it does give a. And the important thing was also to include like whatever sort of slang came our way, and not only like the politically correct slang. So a lot of it is like offensive, or like demeaning terms, but it's important that these be put in a sort of context where, like, this is part of the language. um and some of those terms are like, like coded ways of people referring to each other,
Mm-hmm.
and some are very like
You're
direct. And yeah.
yeah. So I want to transition into Arabic and South Asian crossings.
Mhm.
Your father's Kashmiri heritage was disrupted by partition, cutting off his ability to fully access certain linguistic traditions. How did this personal history shape your relationship with language?
That's a really good question. I had a complex sort of I had a little bit of a complicated upbringing because of family circumstances to do with my own parents and my mom, and I couldn't grow up with them. Um, my
Mhm.
dad, uh, my dad is of Kashmiri origin, although he never lived in Kashmir. He was born in Lahore, and then migrated after the partition with my grandma, his mother, and his two siblings. But Urdu was definitely their mother tongue, and I can see how for my family who's remained in India and the younger the younger generation, Urdu is not their mother tongue anymore. It's been kind of marginalized and ghettoized in India, and
Mhm.
so I think my dad, as a after he emigrated, kind of taught himself or retaught himself Urdu to some extent, as a way of reconnecting to that heritage and not just losing it completely. So he has an incredible amount of fairs and ghalib memorized. Um, but I think for me, the sort of by accident kind of ending up getting into Arabic was also a way of for me of reconnecting to that heritage, because I only very sort of superficially learned the script, the Urdu script as a kid. We never had it in school in India. But after a year or so of Arabic, I found suddenly, lo and behold, I can read Urdu, and that was an amazing experience. Even if I could read it slowly and so on, and it's not the some of the orthographic conventions are different. It's a little bit more difficult, but at the same time, once you read it, 95% of the words are familiar or known. And so that was an amazing way of for me of reconnecting to my Urdu heritage in a kind of a circular and roundabout way, rather than the sort of traditional or more logical thing would just have been, okay, let's study Urdu in college. But for some reason, I didn't do that, at least straight away.
Okay.